Catherine Reynolds had interviewed 47 candidates in 3 weeks. 47 perfectly qualified professionals with impeccable credentials and glowing references. Not one of them had made her daughter look up from the floor. The glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor of Reynolds Tech headquarters had become a theater of failure. Each morning, Jennifer Park arranged the leather chairs with precision set-out water glasses that went untouched and queued up resumes on the tablet that Catherine barely glanced at anymore. The ritual had lost meaning somewhere around candidate number 23. Sophie sat in the corner with Winston, the stuffed elephant that had become her only reliable companion since the divorce. Her small hands stayed folded in her lap, fingers occasionally tracing the worn velvet of Winston's ears. The parade of speech therapists and child development specialists and behavioral interventionists had learned to speak around her silence, filling the air with jargon about progressive desensitization and structured exposure protocols. Catherine had stopped listening after the first dozen. 8 months, $180,000 in specialists, zero progress. She had built Reynolds Tech from a cramped studio apartment and a maxed-out credit card into a $2 billion software empire in 12 years. Problems yielded to analysis. Break them into components. Optimize, execute. But her daughter remained unsolved, and the numbers haunted her in meetings on the drive home, in the moments before sleep when the house settled into quiet that felt more like accusation than peace. Candidate 48 was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Jennifer had flagged the resume with a small note. No formal credentials. Came through Bennett Construction referral. Catherine almost canceled. The people with doctorates had accomplished nothing. What could someone without proper credentials possibly offer? 9 o'clock came and went. Jennifer refreshed her tablet, checked her phone, sent a text. 9:15. The conference room stayed empty except for Catherine, Sophie, and Winston. 9:20. Catherine stood to leave. Then a man in steel-toed boots and a faded Carhartt jacket walked through the door. 20 minutes late, sawdust on his jeans, hands bearing calluses and scars of someone who worked with tools and rough materials. Catherine opened her mouth to dismiss him. Marcus Chen knelt down to Sophie's eye level without saying a word. Catherine froze. The man didn't apologize for his tardiness, didn't launch into practice qualifications, didn't try to engage Sophie with forced enthusiasm or colorful toys. He simply waited. His hands moved. Simple gestures, fluid and deliberate. Sophie's shoulders shifted, a microscopic change Catherine wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't spent 8 months cataloging her daughter's every micro-expression. Sophie looked up. Catherine had forgotten what her daughter's eyes looked like when they focused on another human being. The therapists and specialists had received blank stares or averted gazes. This stranger in work boots got eye contact. Marcus's hands continued their silent conversation. His fingers formed shapes that Sophie watched with an intensity Catherine recognized from before. Before the divorce. Before James's affair with the marketing director. Before the night Sophie walked in on her parents screaming at each other with violence that left broken glass on the floor and a child too terrified to speak. Sophie's hands trembled as she lifted them from her lap. Her fingers fumbled through an awkward approximation of the shapes Marcus had shown her. Wrong angles, hesitant movements. But she was trying. For the first time since James moved to San Francisco with his new wife, Sophie was actively engaging with another human being. Marcus smiled, not the broad, performative grin of the specialist trying to coax a reaction, just a small shift at the corners of his mouth that somehow conveyed more patience than Catherine had seen in months of therapy sessions. He repeated his gesture more slowly, breaking it down into smaller components. Sophie tried again, closer this time. Marcus nodded. A sound escaped Sophie's throat, high and bright and completely unexpected. Laughter, silent laughter, no voice behind it, but unmistakably joy. Catherine gripped the edge of the conference table. She had spent a small fortune on specialists, read every peer-reviewed study on selective mutism, consulted physicians at 3 different children's hospitals. None of them had produced this sound. Jennifer appeared at her elbow, tablet poised, her whisper barely carried across the room. Should I end this? He doesn't have any of the required certifications. His background check is still pending. We could politely ask him to leave. Catherine watched the silent conversation unfolding before her. Marcus was teaching Sophie something new now, a two-handed gesture that seemed to represent an animal. Sophie's eyes widened with delight. Her hands moved eagerly, mimicking his movements with increasing confidence. Pull his file. Everything you can find. Jennifer's heels clicked against the marble floor as she stepped away. Catherine remained frozen, watching this stranger communicate with her daughter in a language she didn't understand but somehow felt in her chest anyway. When the exchange between Marcus and Sophie seemed to reach a natural pause, the man finally stood and turned to face Catherine. He didn't apologize for being late, didn't launch into a practiced speech about his qualifications. He simply met her gaze with quiet steadiness and waited. You know sign language. Catherine stated it as fact, not question. Her voice came out sharper than intended, the edges still rough from months of disappointment. I do. Why would a carpenter from Seattle know American Sign Language? Marcus's expression flickered. Pain, perhaps, or memory. I had a daughter. She was deaf. The past tense hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Catherine suppressed the unfamiliar sensation shifting in her chest. This was not the time for sentiment. This was a business decision like any other. How did she pass away? Car accident. 5 years ago, she was 4. He delivered the words without emotion, but Catherine saw his knuckles whiten slightly, the grip of a man who had learned to carry his grief in silence. I'm sorry for your loss, but Sophie isn't deaf. She can hear perfectly well. She simply chooses not to speak. I know. I read her file before I came. Catherine's jaw tightened. The presumption of this man showing up late in work boots, claiming to understand her daughter based on a file he shouldn't have had access to in the first place. Then you understand that sign language isn't the solution her doctors have recommended. They believe verbal communication therapy is the appropriate approach. Structured intervention, progressive desensitization to speaking situations. Marcus glanced back at Sophie, who was watching them with obvious interest. Winston sat in her lap, a silent witness to the proceedings. With respect, ma'am, I'm not sure those doctors have ever tried listening to her. The words landed like a slap. Catherine's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She was not accustomed to being challenged, certainly not by someone who installed cabinets for a living. She had listened to every expert in 3 states. She had read every peer-reviewed study on selective mutism. She had implemented every evidence-based intervention available. I've listened to every expert who would take my calls. I've spent 8 months and more money than most people see in a lifetime trying to help my daughter. Don't presume to tell me about listening. I wasn't talking about listening to experts. I was talking about listening to her. Actually listening. Meeting her where she is instead of trying to drag her somewhere she doesn't want to go. Jennifer returned before Catherine could formulate a response that wouldn't involve security escorting this man from the building. The tablet displayed a sparse resume and a few scanned documents. Marcus Chen, 36 years old, high school diploma, trade certification in carpentry, employed by Bennett Construction for the past 4 years. Before that, a 3-year gap in employment history with a note from a volunteer coordinator at Washington State School for the Deaf. What happened during these 3 years? Catherine tapped the screen, highlighting the gap. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, the same shadow she'd seen when he mentioned his daughter. I told you I had a daughter. She died when she was 4. Those 3 years I was taking care of her, learning sign language, learning how to be her father in the language she could understand. The matter-of-fact delivery somehow made the words hit harder. Catherine had expected defensiveness or an appeal for sympathy. Instead, she got truth without embellishment. There's a note here from your previous volunteer work. The director wrote a personal commendation. She said you had a gift for reaching children who had given up on being reached. Marcus said nothing. He didn't elaborate or defend himself. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting for whatever judgment Catherine would render. Every instinct she had developed over 15 years in business told her this was wrong. He had no credentials, no experience with selective mutism, no letters after his name, no certifications on his wall, no references from child development specialists. He was a carpenter who happened to know sign language because tragedy had forced him to learn it. His resume was grief. His qualification was loss. His teaching method was patience, born from loving someone who could not communicate in conventional ways. And yet Sophie's hands were moving again. Small gestures directed at Marcus, asking him something that Catherine could not understand. He responded without hesitation. his fingers forming shapes that made the little girl's eyes brighten with comprehension. 1 week, trial basis. You'll submit to a full background check, sign a comprehensive NDA, and agree to strict supervision protocols. If anything raises concerns, you will be terminated immediately. Is that understood? Understood. Jennifer will provide you with the terms of employment. You'll start tomorrow. Catherine turned on her heel and walked toward the door. Her back straight, her expression controlled. But just before she reached the threshold, she paused without turning around. Mr. Chen, what did you say to her, that first thing when you walked in? What did it mean? Marcus's response was quiet, almost gentle. I told her she didn't have to talk if she didn't want to. I told her silence isn't something to be ashamed of. Catherine did not reply. She stepped through the door and let it close behind her, leaving her daughter in the care of a man she had known for less than an hour. It was the most irrational decision she had made in her entire professional life. It was also, though she did not know it yet, the first step toward learning a language she had never thought to study. The contract Catherine presented the following morning was 22 pages long. Marcus read every word while sitting in the austere waiting area outside her home office, a space decorated with abstract art that probably cost more than his annual salary. The document was thorough, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. It outlined his duties, his limitations, and the extensive list of behaviors that would result in immediate termination. He was not to form emotional attachments with the child. He was not to discuss his personal history in detail. He was not to attempt any therapeutic interventions beyond basic supervision. He was not under any circumstances to position himself as a parental figure. Clause 14 was underlined in bold: employee shall not form emotional attachments with minor or position self as parental figure. Violation of this clause constitutes grounds for immediate termination without notice or severance. Marcus signed each page without argument. The pen felt heavy in his hand, weighted with implications he understood better than Catherine probably realized. When he reached the final signature line, Catherine emerged from her office, already dressed for a day of meetings, in a charcoal suit that matched her eyes. You understand the boundaries. It wasn't a question. Her voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I do. Sophie's schedule is posted in the kitchen. Her dietary restrictions are documented. Her current therapy protocols are outlined in the binder on the counter. Follow them precisely. Marcus nodded. Catherine gathered her briefcase and moved toward the front door. She paused with her hand on the handle, her back still turned to him. One more thing, Mr. Chen. I've had the security system upgraded. There are cameras in every common area. I will be monitoring them. I would expect nothing less. For a moment, something in Catherine's posture seemed to waver. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked out the door without looking back. The sound of her car pulling away echoed through the too-large house. Sophie appeared in the hallway approximately 30 seconds after her mother's departure. She was dressed in expensive clothes that looked uncomfortable, her dark hair pulled back in a style too severe for her age. She stood at the edge of the living room, watching Marcus with the wary assessment of an animal deciding whether a new presence represented threat or safety. Marcus lowered himself to sit on the floor, bringing his eyes level with hers. Then he waited. Several minutes passed in complete silence. Sophie did not move. Marcus did not move. The house hummed with the quiet efficiency of its climate control system, the only sound in a space that felt designed to suppress noise rather than welcome it. Finally, Sophie's hands moved. Her gesture was a question. Marcus recognized the sign for why. He responded carefully, his hands forming words she would understand. Why am I here? Because your mother asked me to spend time with you. Because you know a language I know too. Sophie considered this. Her fingers moved again. My mother does not know this language. No, she doesn't. The little girl's expression shifted, became somehow older and sadder than any 6-year-old's face should be. She signed one more word. Why Marcus did not have an answer for that. Instead, he raised his hands and asked her a question of his own. What would you like to do today? For a long moment, Sophie did not respond. Then she turned and walked down the hallway, glancing back once to see if Marcus was following. He rose and followed her to a playroom filled with educational toys still in their original packaging, therapy tools, organized in labeled bins, and a window seat piled with picture books that showed no signs of ever having been opened. Sophie ignored all of it. She walked to a corner where Winston sat alone on a low shelf, picked him up, and brought him back to Marcus. She placed the elephant in his hands with a solemnity that suggested a sacred trust. Her hands moved in sign language. His name is Winston. He is my friend. Deshtut. He does not talk either. Marcus cradled the elephant gently. Then it's nice to meet you, Winston. I don't talk much myself. For the second time since they had met, the ghost of a smile crossed Sophie's face. In the corporate tower downtown, Catherine Reynolds watched the security feed on her laptop while her executive team droned through quarterly projections. She saw Marcus sitting on the playroom floor, having what appeared to be a three-way conversation with her daughter and a stuffed elephant. His hands moved constantly, telling stories or jokes, or whatever nonsense one told to a silent child and her imaginary companion. Sophie's hands moved too. She was engaged, animated, present, in a way Catherine had not seen since before the silence began. Something twisted in Catherine's chest in a motion she did not recognize. She closed the laptop and returned her attention to the spreadsheets before her. Numbers she understood, profit margins made sense. The quarterly forecast was something she could control. Her daughter's smile glimpsed through a security camera was something else entirely. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that Catherine observed but could not quite comprehend. Every morning Marcus arrived precisely at 8. Every evening he departed at 6. In between, he and Sophie inhabited a world of silence that seemed somehow richer than any conversation Catherine had ever conducted in boardrooms or conference calls. They told stories with their hands, elaborate narratives that involved Winston and a cast of imaginary characters whose adventures grew more complex with each passing day. They went on walks through the neighborhood, Marcus teaching Sophie the signs for every tree flower and bird they encountered. They cooked simple meals together, Sophie learning the signs for ingredients and utensils, with a focus that none of her expensive tutors had ever managed to inspire. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sophie began to laugh. The first time it happened, Catherine was in her home office reviewing contracts when she heard an unfamiliar sound drifting up from the kitchen. High and bright, it caught in her ears like something half-remembered from a dream. She rose from her desk and moved toward the source, her heels clicking against the hardwood with uncharacteristic hesitation. She found them at the kitchen island, surrounded by the aftermath of what appeared to be an extremely unsuccessful attempt at making pancakes. Flour covered the counter of the floor and a significant portion of Marcus's shirt. Sophie stood on a step stool, her hands coated in batter. Her face transformed by the widest smile Catherine had ever seen her wear. Marcus was telling her something in sign language, his flour-dusted fingers moving in exaggerated gestures that suggested he was describing a great culinary disaster. Sophie watched with rapt attention, then responded with her own signs, her movements quick and confident. Then something extraordinary happened. The little girl laughed. It was not a word. She still did not speak. But the sound that emerged from her throat was unmistakably joy, a pure expression of happiness that required no translation. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, surprising even Sophie herself. Marcus laughed too, a warm sound that matched hers perfectly. Soon the two of them were engaged in what appeared to be a comedic critique of his culinary abilities, their hands flying through signs that Catherine could not understand, but somehow felt in her chest anyway. Catherine stood in the doorway. She had spent over $100,000 on specialists. She had consulted physicians at 3 different children's hospitals. She had implemented every intervention recommended by every expert she could find, and none of it, not a single expensive hour of professional treatment, had produced this sound. This stranger, this carpenter with no credentials and no degrees, had made her daughter laugh by failing to make pancakes. Marcus noticed her standing there. He straightened up, suddenly self-conscious, gesturing apologetically at the mess surrounding them. "I'm sorry about the kitchen. I'll clean everything up. We were just no." The word came out more sharply than Catherine intended. She softened her voice with effort. "No, it's fine. Continue." She turned and walked back to her office, closing the door behind her with careful precision. Then she sat in her expensive ergonomic chair, stared at the contract on her desk, and allowed herself to feel something she had not allowed in years. Tears slid down her cheeks in silent streams, leaving tracks in her carefully applied makeup. She did not wipe them away. She simply sat there listening to the faint sounds of her daughter's laughter drifting through the walls and wondered when exactly she had stopped knowing how to reach her own child. That evening, after Marcus left and Sophie was drawing in her room, Catherine approached the kitchen, where flowers still dusted the corners. She opened her laptop and typed a search into Google. American Sign Language Basics. The results filled her screen. Tutorial videos, online courses, dictionaries of hand shapes and movements. She clicked on a beginner's guide and watched a woman demonstrate the alphabet. The shapes looked simple on the screen. When Catherine tried to replicate them, her fingers felt clumsy and uncertain. She practiced for an hour copying gestures from the video, feeling ridiculous and desperate in equal measure. The house was quiet except for the soft click of her laptop and the occasional sound of Sophie moving in her room down the hall. When Sophie emerged for dinner, Catherine was still sitting at the kitchen island, her hands attempting to form the sign for mother. The shape eluded her. Her fingers wouldn't cooperate. Sophie stopped in the doorway watching. Catherine hadn't realized her daughter was there. Heat rose to her face, embarrassed to be caught fumbling with something a 6-year-old had learned in weeks. "I'm trying to learn. I want to talk to you." Her hands moved in clumsy approximation of the signs she'd been watching. The shapes were wrong. Sophie's expression flickered with something Catherine couldn't read. Then the little girl turned and walked back to her room without responding. Catherine sat alone in the kitchen, her hands still forming incorrect shapes. The weight of 8 months of failure settled over her shoulders. It went like a physical thing she couldn't shrug off. The board meeting that Thursday did not go well. Richard Ashford, the longest-serving member of Reynolds Tech's board of directors, had never approved of Catherine's unconventional approach to childcare. He was a man who believed in systems, in credentials, in the proper order of things. A carpenter teaching sign language to a CEO's daughter violated every principle he held dear. This handyman situation is becoming a liability. Richard leaned forward in his chair at the head of the conference table. His voice carried across the room with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He was 62, silver-haired, wealthy in the way that made other wealthy people feel poor. His 8% stake in the company gave him more power than his title suggested. The optics are problematic. A single man alone with your daughter for hours each day. No professional credentials. No oversight from medical professionals. Do you have any idea how this looks to our investors? To the media, to anyone paying attention, Catherine's jaw tightened. My daughter's care is not a board matter. Everything about your life is a board matter when you're the face of a publicly traded company. Shareholders have concerns. Our insurance advisors have concerns. I have concerns. This company's reputation is built on your image, Catherine. The brilliant, decisive leader who makes smart choices. This choice does not look smart. My daughter is thriving. Your daughter is being supervised by someone who installs cabinets for a living. How do you think that will play when some reporter decides to dig into your personal life? CEO of Reynolds Tech entrusts her special needs child to unlicensed caregiver? The headlines write themselves. Dr. Margaret Chen, the child psychologist the board had recommended months ago, cleared her throat delicately. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and credentials from institutions that intimidated even Catherine. Perhaps we could discuss transitioning Sophie to a more structured environment. The residential program I mentioned has had excellent results with similar cases. Full-time professional supervision, evidence-based interventions, accountability measures. Catherine's hands curled into fists beneath the table. My daughter is not a case, and she's not going to any residential program. Catherine. Richard's tone was the patronizing kind that made her want to throw something. We understand this is emotional for you, but the board has a fiduciary responsibility to consider. Your judgment in this matter has been compromised by maternal instinct. Let the professionals handle it. The professionals have failed. This man has succeeded. That's all the evidence I need. Richard leaned back, fingers steepled. Then I'm calling for a vote. All in favor of requiring Catherine to terminate Marcus Chen's employment and transition Sophie Reynolds to Harborview Residential Academy indicate by raising your hand. 4 hands went up. Sarah Chen, the CFO, kept her hand down, but wouldn't meet Catherine's eyes. Thomas Park, the COO, shook his head slowly. The vote was split. Richard's expression hardened. This isn't over, Catherine. I'm putting it on record. If anything happens to Sophie while under this man's care, the board will hold you personally accountable, and I will use every share I own to remove you from this company. Noted. Catherine's voice was ice. The meeting ended without resolution, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Change the arrangement, or face consequences that extended far beyond her daughter's therapy schedule. Catherine drove home that evening with Richard's words echoing in her head, warring against the memory of Sophie's laughter in a flower-covered kitchen. She found Marcus preparing to leave, gathering his jacket from the hook by the door. Sophie was in the playroom engaged in some elaborate game with Winston and several new stuffed animal recruits who had apparently joined the menagerie. Mr. Chen a word. Marcus followed her to the front hall. His expression was neutral but watchful, the look of someone who had learned to read trouble before it arrived. The board isn't happy about this arrangement. I gathered that might be a possibility. They want me to replace you with professionals, certified specialists, people with degrees and institutional backing. They threaten to remove me if I don't comply. Marcus absorbed this information without visible reaction. And what do you want? The question caught her off guard. In her world, what she wanted was rarely relevant. There were quarterly targets and shareholder expectations and competitive pressures and 1,000 external demands that dictated every decision. What she wanted had become such a foreign concept that she barely recognized it anymore. I want my daughter to be happy. I want her to laugh like she laughed this morning. I want... She stopped, her voice catching on something unexpected. The words sat heavy in her throat, refusing to emerge. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. I was going to give this to you anyway. It's a list of basic signs, the ones Sophie uses most often. I thought you might want to learn them. Catherine stared at the paper in his outstretched hand. A list of signs, such a simple thing, so obvious in retrospect that she should feel ashamed for not thinking of it herself. I'm not offering to stay forever. That was never the plan. But if you learn to talk to her yourself, you won't need me. You won't need any of us. You'll just need each other. He placed the paper on the entry table and reached for his jacket. At the door, he paused without turning around. For what it's worth, Ms. Reynolds, I don't think your judgment is compromised. I think you're the only person in that boardroom who actually sees your daughter as a person instead of a problem to be solved. Then he was gone, and Catherine was alone in her enormous house with a piece of paper that held the key to a language she had never thought to learn. The anonymous complaint arrived 3 weeks later. It landed on Catherine's desk via registered mail, a formal document alleging inappropriate conduct between Marcus Chen and a minor in his care. The accusations were vague but damaging, carefully worded to imply wrongdoing without making specific claims that could be easily disproved. Catherine read it twice, her face carefully blank. Then she called her legal team. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Security footage was reviewed. Neighbors were interviewed. Marcus's background was examined with microscopic precision. Every interaction, every moment of contact between him and Sophie was scrutinized for evidence of the alleged misconduct. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Every frame of security footage showed only a patient man teaching a lonely child how to communicate. Every interview revealed only admiration for his dedication and skill. Every piece of evidence pointed to exactly what Marcus had always been, a grieving father who had transformed his loss into a gift for others. But the damage was done. Company policy required that any accused party be suspended pending the outcome of an investigation. It did not matter that the accusations were baseless. It did not matter that the complaint had all the hallmarks of a coordinated attack. Protocol was protocol, and Catherine had built her company on the principle that rules applied to everyone, including herself. Marcus accepted the news without protest, without anger, without any visible emotion at all. He simply nodded, collected his jacket, and walked out of the house that had become his second home. At the door, he paused and looked back at Catherine with an expression she could not read. Tell Sophie I'll be back. Tell her this isn't her fault. She needs to know that. Then he was gone, and the house fell silent in a way that felt like condemnation. Sophie's response was not so measured. The first sign came that evening when she refused to eat dinner. She pushed her plate away with deliberate force, her eyes fixed on the empty chair where Marcus usually sat during meals. When Catherine tried to engage her in sign language using the basic vocabulary she had been practicing from Marcus's list, Sophie turned away. The second day was worse. Sophie stopped signing altogether. She retreated to her room and refused to come out, not for meals, not for the expensive therapist Catherine called in desperation, not for anything. When Catherine finally entered unbidden, she found her daughter curled on her bed with Winston clutched to her chest, her eyes open but focused on nothing. It was the silence of before, the absence that had terrified Catherine into hiring a parade of specialists. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like accusation. By the third day, Catherine understood what she had done. She had prioritized liability over love. She had chosen corporate protocol over her daughter's well-being. She had allowed fear of what others might think to destroy the one relationship that had actually helped Sophie heal. The investigation concluded on day 4. Marcus was cleared of all accusations. The complaint, it turned out, had originated from an IP address traced back to a computer in the Reynolds Tech building. The sender's identity remained officially unknown, but Catherine had her suspicions. She found Marcus at a coffee shop near his apartment, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of black coffee and a newspaper he was not really reading. He looked up when she approached, his expression carefully neutral. Catherine had practiced this speech during the drive over. She had prepared talking points and contingency responses and all the professional scaffolding that usually supported her communications. Now standing before him in jeans and a sweater, instead of her usual corporate armor, all of it evaporated. I made a mistake. Marcus said nothing. He waited as he always did, offering space for whatever came next. Not as a CEO, as a mother. The complaint was baseless. You've been cleared. I could offer you your position back with a substantial raise and pretend this never happened. Catherine sat down across from him, her hands flat on the table. But that's not why I'm here. Then why are you here? Because my daughter hasn't smiled in 4 days. Because she won't eat. Because she's retreated back into the silence I spent 18 months trying to break, and I did that to her. I caused it by choosing the wrong priorities. Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her lips together, fighting for composure. I'm not asking you to come back as an employee. I'm asking you to help me learn how to reach her myself. Teach me. Not because it's good for optics or because the board will approve. Teach me because I'm her mother and I should have learned this language years ago. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. One condition, name it. You don't get to hide behind contracts and protocols anymore. This isn't a business arrangement. If you want to learn to talk to your daughter, you have to actually talk to her. Not manage her, and her, not optimize her. Talk to her as a person. Catherine nodded. I can do that. Can you? Because from what I've seen, control is your first language. Letting go might be harder than you think. Then teach me that too. For the first time since she had known him, Marcus smiled. The lessons began that weekend. They sat in Catherine's living room, the expensive furniture pushed aside to create space for movement, and Marcus showed her how to shape silence into meaning. The first sign he taught her was the same one he had shown to Sophie on that first day. It meant I hear you even when you don't speak. Catherine practiced it until her fingers ached, until the motion became fluid instead of mechanical. The second sign meant I'm sorry. She practiced that one even longer. Sophie watched from the hallway, half hidden behind a door frame, observing her mother's clumsy attempts at communication. Winston was clutched in her arms, a silent witness to this new development. She did not participate. She did not approach. But she watched, and that was something. Marcus returned the next day and the day after that. Not as an employee bound by contract, but as a teacher helping a student learn the language her daughter spoke. Catherine canceled meetings to practice. She hired a sign language tutor to supplement Marcus's instruction. She covered her home office walls with vocabulary charts and practiced in front of the mirror until she could manage simple conversations without pausing to remember each gesture. One evening, Sophie ventured into the living room while Catherine was practicing alone. The little girl stood at the edge of the rug, watching her mother's hands move through the signs for a children's story Catherine had memorized. Catherine stopped when she noticed her daughter. She raised her hands, suddenly nervous in a way board meetings never made her. I'm learning your language. I want to talk to you. Sophie's expression was unreadable. Then her small hands moved. You're doing it wrong. The story doesn't go like that. Something bloomed in Catherine's chest, warm and unfamiliar. Show me. Show me how it goes. Sophie hesitated. Then she crossed the room and sat beside her mother on the floor. Winston was positioned between them like a mediator. Slowly, with the patience of a teacher far older than her years, Sophie began to correct her mother's signs. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Late that night after Sophie had gone to bed, Catherine sat alone in her home office. The quarterly reports lay untouched on her desk. The stack of contracts requiring her signature gathered dust. Instead, she opened the file Jennifer had compiled weeks ago, the complete background check on Marcus Chen. She'd avoided reading the medical records until now. Part of her hadn't wanted to know. But after today, after Sophie had finally looked at her again, Catherine needed to understand the man who had made that possible. The records were sparse but devastating. Marcus Chen. Date of birth, April 15, 1988. Daughter, Lily Chen. Date of birth, March 3, 2016. Date of death, July 20, 2020. Cause blunt force trauma motor vehicle accident. Medical history. Marcus Chen clean until August 2024. Then pancreatic adenocarcinoma, stage 2A. Initial diagnosis, August 12, 2024. Patient declined treatment. Follow-up, October 18, 24. Tumor progression noted. Patient enrolled in experimental protocol treatment to begin November 2024. Catherine's hands stilled on the keyboard. The diagnosis was 4 months old, not 6, and Marcus had refused treatment initially. He'd only agreed to the experimental protocol 2 months ago, right around the time Sophie had started laughing again. He had been dying when she hired him. He was still dying now. But somewhere in those 4 months, he'd decided to fight. Not for himself, Catherine suspected. For Sophie. For the child who reminded him of the daughter he'd lost. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't using Sophie as a redemption project. Sophie was giving him a reason to choose treatment over giving up. Catherine closed the file and sat in the darkness of her office, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, her daughter slept with Winston tucked under her arm. Somewhere across the city, a man with maybe 18 months to live had chosen to spend his remaining time teaching a silent child how to speak without words. She had built an empire by controlling outcomes, by bending circumstances to her will, through preparation and determination and sheer refusal to accept defeat. But she could not control this. She could not manage Marcus's diagnosis or negotiate with the cancer or optimize away the reality of mortality. She could only show up, learn the language, be present for whatever time remained. For a woman who had spent 15 years measuring success in quarterly increments, it was perhaps the hardest lesson she would ever learn. Catherine arrived at Marcus's apartment before sunrise. She had driven through empty Seattle streets with the medical file open on her passenger seat, a document that had kept her awake through the night. The building was modest industrial neighborhood, the kind of place where people worked with their hands and came home too tired to notice peeling paint. She knocked. Marcus answered in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, his hair uncombed, surprise evident in his eyes. The surprise faded quickly into something else. Recognition, perhaps. He had known this conversation would come eventually. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice came out harder than she intended, sharpened by exhaustion and anger she didn't fully understand. "Tell you what," Catherine pulled the medical file from her jacket and held it up. The paper trembled slightly in her grip. "This. That you're dying, that you refused treatment for 2 months, that you only started fighting when—" She stopped. The implication hung between them. Marcus stepped back from the door, allowing her entry. The apartment was spare. A couch that had seen better decades. A small kitchen table with 1 chair. Photographs on the wall of a little girl with cochlear implants, her hands frozen mid-sign in captured moments of joy. "I didn't think it mattered. You're dying, and you didn't think it mattered. I'm dying slowly. I have time. How much time? And why did you refuse treatment?" Marcus moved to his small kitchen, filled a kettle with water that ran too loudly in the morning quiet. His hands were steady despite the weight of the conversation. "After Lily died, I didn't see the point. Pancreatic cancer, stage 2. The statistics aren't kind. 15% 5-year survival. I figured I'd rather have 6 good months than 18 months of hell." "What changed, Sophie?" The simplicity of the answer made Catherine's throat constrict. "I watched her laugh at burnt pancakes, and I realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to make someone happy. I'd spent 4 years grieving, and suddenly there was this kid who needed what I had to give. So I called the oncologist back. You chose chemo because of my daughter. I chose to fight because your daughter reminded me what I was fighting for." Catherine sank onto his couch without invitation. The cushions were worn soft by years of use. She imagined him sitting here alone in the evenings, after losing Lily, learning to carry grief in a space too empty for the life he'd planned. The kettle whistled. Marcus poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, brought one to Catherine without asking if she wanted it. The gesture felt intimate in a way that made her uncomfortable. When does treatment start? 2 weeks. Clinical trial at UW Medical. New protocol, 12% success rate, but it's better than nothing. The side effects will be rough. I'll need to take days off when I can't function. You should have told me from the beginning. Would you have hired me if I had? Catherine had no answer. She drank the coffee even though it was too hot, letting it burn her tongue as punishment for coming here with accusations instead of questions. We continue. But you tell me when things change, when you're struggling, when I'm dying faster than expected. His bluntness was a slap that Catherine realized she'd earned. Yes, then I promise you'll know. But Catherine, what? Don't make this about me. This is about Sophie learning to communicate, about you learning her language. I'm just the translator. When I'm gone, you two will still have each other. They sat in silence as dawn, light filtered through a single window, illuminating dust motes that danced between them like all the unspoken truths hanging in the air. The lessons intensified after that morning. Marcus came to Catherine's house 3 evenings a week after his shifts at Bennett Construction ended, his clothes still carrying traces of sawdust in honest work. They cleared space in her living room, pushing aside furniture that cost more than most cars, and he showed her how language could exist without sound. The first night, Catherine's hands felt clumsy, her fingers refusing to bend into the shapes that Marcus demonstrated with fluid ease. She was accustomed to mastering skills quickly, to applying intelligence and determination until obstacles yielded. Sign language resisted her usual approach. You're treating signs like a checklist. They're alive. Watch. Marcus signed a simple phrase, I love you. His face softened, his body language opened, the words extending beyond his hands into his entire presence. Now you. Catherine copied the handshapes. Technically correct, emotionally vacant. Again. But this time think about Sophie, actually feel it. Catherine tried again. Tears formed at the corners of her eyes before she finished the phrase. The shapes carried weight they hadn't held before. Better. Language isn't just in your hands. It's in your heart, your face, your intention. You can say, I love you and mean I own you if your body doesn't match your words. That night, Sophie emerged from her room and stood in the doorway watching her mother struggle with signs for animals. Catherine formed the shape for elephant incorrectly. Sophie's hands moved before she seemed to realize it, correcting the gesture. Like this. Her voice was silent, but her meaning was clear. Catherine adjusted her hands, following her daughter's instruction. When she got it right, Sophie's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something softer than the walls she'd built. Can you teach me the story about Winston? Sophie hesitated. Then she nodded. They sat together on the floor with the elephant between them, while Sophie taught her mother a story about a brave elephant who had lost his voice but learned to speak with his trunk. It was clumsy, improvised, built from signs Sophie had learned and invented, but it was communication. Real communication flowing between them for the first time in 8 months. Marcus watched from the edge of the room, his expression unreadable. The board meeting the following Tuesday was worse than the first. Richard Ashford had rallied support over the weekend, and he came prepared with ammunition. I've retained counsel. Richard slid a document across the conference table. Catherine picked it up, her jaw tightening as she scanned the contents. A lawsuit, not yet, a legal opinion, outlining the board's fiduciary responsibility to protect shareholder interests, outlining the liability exposure created by your employment of an unqualified individual in a sensitive childcare role, outlining the grounds for removal of a CEO whose personal decisions create material risk to the company. You're threatening to sue me for hiring a babysitter. I'm protecting this company from your reckless judgment. The opinion is clear. If we knowingly allow you to continue this arrangement and something happens to Sophie's shareholders can sue the board for breach of duty, we could be personally liable for millions. Sarah Chen, the CFO, shifted uncomfortably. Catherine, maybe we could find a compromise, keep Marcus on, but add a credentialed supervisor, someone with a license who can provide oversight. No. Catherine's voice was flat. Sophie is finally making progress. I'm not adding another stranger to evaluate and document and turn her healing into a research project. Then you're forcing our hand. Richard leaned forward. I'm calling another vote, all in favor of requiring Catherine to either add credentialed supervision or terminate Marcus Chen's employment indicate now. This time 6 hands went up. Only Thomas Park and one other board member kept their hands down. The vote was no longer split. Motion carries. You have 2 weeks to comply, Catherine. Add proper supervision or fire him. If you refuse, we'll have grounds to remove you for breach of fiduciary duty. Catherine stood gathering her materials with controlled fury. Noted. This meeting is adjourned. She walked out before anyone could see her hands shaking. That evening, Catherine sat in her home office staring at the legal opinion Richard had provided. It was thorough, professionally crafted, and legally sound. The board could remove her. They probably would if she continued to defy them. Her phone buzzed. Jennifer, have you seen the stock price? Catherine pulled up the chart. Down 4% in after-hours trading. Someone had leaked news of the board conflict. Vultures. Jennifer's voice was tight. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Catherine, they have the votes. If you fight this, you'll lose the company. Maybe the company isn't what I should be fighting for. The words surprised Catherine even as she spoke them. Jennifer was silent for a long moment. I've worked for you for 8 years. I've never heard you say anything like that before. Maybe I've never had a reason to say it before. After she hung up, Catherine walked down the hall to Sophie's room. Her daughter was already asleep. Winston tucked under her arm, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed watching Sophie breathe. Marcus arrived each morning at 8. Sophie was usually already awake, waiting at the window for his truck to pull into the circular driveway. They spent mornings in Sophie's playroom, afternoons, exploring the neighborhood, or working on the wooden house Marcus was building for Winston in the garage workshop Catherine had converted for his use. Catherine cut her work hours to return home by 5 each day. The board grumbled. Stock prices dipped another 3%. She found she cared less than she would have imagined. Dinners became ritual. The three of them sat at the kitchen table conversing in a hybrid of sign language and spoken words that created its own grammar. Sophie taught Catherine new signs each evening. Marcus told stories about his construction work, hands painting pictures of houses taking shape, and problems solved with patience rather than force. One evening, Sophie signed a question to Marcus that made his expression tighten. What was your daughter like? Marcus set down his fork. Catherine held her breath, unsure whether this was territory he wanted to enter. Funny, stubborn. She loved dinosaurs, had an entire collection of plastic ones that she'd line up by size every night before bed. His hands moved as he spoke, translating his words into the language Lily had understood. Did she talk? She signed. She was born deaf, so signs were her voice. Just like they're your choice now, even though you can hear. Sophie considered this, her small face serious. Were you sad when she did, every day? But talking about her makes me less sad. Remembering the good parts keeps her alive in a way that matters. Do you think she can see us now? I don't know, but I think if she can, she's glad I met you. Because you remind me why it's worth learning how to listen when someone speaks differently than you expect. Sophie smiled, then full and genuine. She reached across the table and took Marcus's hand. The gesture was so natural, so unguarded, that Catherine felt something shift in her understanding of what family could mean. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Marcus lingered at the door longer than usual. Catherine found herself not wanting him to leave. Stay, have coffee, or tea, or wine. She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without revealing more than she intended. Marcus studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. I should go. Early shift tomorrow. But he didn't move toward the door. Marcus, don't say whatever you're about to say. His voice was gentle but firm. Why not? Because I'm dying, Catherine. And you're building something with your daughter that's just starting to take root. Don't confuse gratitude with something else. Don't make this complicated. What if it's already complicated? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to examine. Then we uncomplicate it. I'm here for Sophie. That's the job. He left before she could argue, his truck disappearing down the driveway with a finality that felt like rejection. Catherine stood in her empty foyer, hands forming shapes in the air without conscious thought. The signs for confused, for wanting, for something she didn't have words to name in either English or the language she was still learning. The call from James came on a Tuesday afternoon. Catherine was in her home office reviewing the board's ultimatum when her phone lit up with his name. She almost didn't answer. I want to FaceTime with Sophie. It's been 3 weeks. James's voice carried the petulance of a man accustomed to getting his way through persistence rather than merit. She's at school. Then tonight. I have rights, Catherine, so... The custody agreement. The custody agreement says monthly video calls. You called 2 weeks ago for 8 minutes. Sophie stared at the screen without signing or speaking while you talked about your new house and your stepkids and all the ways your life improved after you left us. So no, James, not tonight. You can't keep my daughter from me. I'm not keeping her from you. You left her. You walked away when she needed you most because her silence made you uncomfortable. You don't get to drop in when it's convenient and expect her to perform for you. She could hear his breathing change, the familiar pattern that preceded his anger. This is about that handyman, isn't it? I heard you hired some random guy with no credentials. What kind of mother? The kind of mother who actually listens to her daughter instead of trying to force her into a shape that's easier to love. When you're ready to learn sign language, when you're ready to meet Sophie where she is instead of where you want her to be, then we can talk about video calls. Until then, you're just another person expecting her to change for your comfort. Catherine ended the call before he could respond. Her hands were shaking. She looked up to find Sophie standing in the doorway, still in her backpack from Jennifer driving her home from school. Her daughter's eyes were wide, but not with fear. With something else. Something that looked almost like pride. Sophie's hands moved. Thank you. 2 signs. Simple. Devastating in their sincerity. Catherine crossed the room and pulled her daughter into an embrace that Sophie, for the first time in months, returned without hesitation. Marcus began staying later, helping Sophie with homework in the evenings, while Catherine prepared meals that grew more ambitious as her confidence increased. They fell into patterns that resembled the family Sophie had lost when James left. One evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch between them during a movie, Marcus carried her to bed. Catherine followed, watching him tuck the blanket around her daughter with the practiced care of someone who had done this before. Winston was positioned in the crook of Sophie's arm, guardian of her dreams. In the hallway with Sophie's door closed behind them, Marcus turned to Catherine. The space between them felt charged with everything they'd been avoiding. She's doing well, better than I expected at this stage. Thanks to you. Thanks to you learning her language. I'm just the translator. You're doing the work. We're both doing the work. Catherine's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Marcus, about what I said before I meant what I said. This needs to stay simple. What if I don't want simple? The words escaped before she could stop them. Marcus's expression shifted, walls cracking to reveal the want beneath. Catherine, I have 18 months, maybe less. I can't give you a future. I'm not asking for the future. I'm asking for now, for whatever time there is. You deserve someone who can grow old with you. Someone who can be there when Sophie graduates high school, gets married, has kids. I can't promise you any of that. You're the man who made my daughter laugh. You're the man who taught me how to actually see her. You're the man who's spending the time you have left helping us heal. Don't tell me I deserve more than that. There isn't more than that. Marcus closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the walls were gone. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Their fingers intertwined slowly, carefully, like the formation of a sign that needed to be perfect. I can't promise you anything except that I'll be here every day I can be. And that might not be enough. It's enough. He pulled her closer, and she went, pressing her forehead against his chest. His heart beat steady beneath her ear. Alive. Present. Here. They stood in the hallway outside Sophie's room, holding each other in the half-light until the house settled around them and the moment crystallized into memory. The weeks that followed were careful. They didn't tell Sophie about the shift in their relationship, but the child noticed anyway. She began including Marcus more deliberately in her drawings of family, positioning him next to Catherine, with Winston standing guard between them. Catherine found herself anticipating Marcus's arrival with an eagerness that felt foreign. She, who had built an empire through discipline and control, was learning to exist in uncertainty, to find joy in the present without demanding guarantees about the future. They stole moments when Sophie was occupied. A kiss in the garage while the child focused on painting Winston's wooden house. Hands clasped under the kitchen table during dinner. Quiet conversations on the front porch after Sophie had gone to bed, where Marcus told her about Lily and Catherine shared truths about her marriage that she'd never spoken aloud. One night, Marcus showed her photos on his phone. Lily at 2 learning her first signs. Lily at 3 covered in finger paint from a project that had gotten gloriously out of control. Lily at 4 hours before the accident signing "I love you, Daddy" with a grin that could break hearts. I was driving, taking her to speech therapy, which in hindsight is darkly funny, since she didn't need speech therapy, she needed the world to learn her language. Drunk driver ran a red light, T-boned us on Lily's side. She died on impact. Catherine's throat constricted. Marcus, don't, don't apologize for something that wasn't your fault. I spent 3 years drowning in people's apologies. What I needed was someone to let me remember her without treating her death like a topic to avoid. You do that. You let me talk about her like she was a real person who mattered, not just a tragedy that happened to me. She mattered. She matters. Because she's part of what made you the person Sophie needed. Marcus pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. They sat on her porch swing wrapped in each other, and the ghosts of daughters present and past until the Seattle drizzle began and they had to move inside. Jennifer noticed the change first. She arrived one morning with Catherine's schedule and found Marcus in the kitchen making coffee like he belonged there. Sophie was at the table doing homework, signing questions to Marcus about fractions that he answered with carpenter's precision. You're here early. Jennifer's tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes cataloged everything, the ease between them, the domestic comfort, the way Catherine's hand brushed Marcus's shoulder as she passed. Sophie needed help with math homework. Marcus is better at explaining fractions than the tutors we've hired. Jennifer raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Later in Catherine's office, she placed the schedule on the desk with deliberate care. The annual gala is in 6 weeks. The board is expecting your speech. Shareholders will be there. Media, every tech blog in the city. I know. Are you bringing Sophie? Jennifer's question carried weight beyond the words. Catherine set down her pen. Yes, and I'm going to sign with her on stage, in front of everyone. Jennifer's professional composure cracked. Catherine, that's what I'm doing. I'm done hiding my daughter because the board thinks selective mutism is bad optics. I'm done pretending that the most important work I've done this year happened in conference rooms instead of on my living room floor learning sign language. The stock price I don't care about the stock price. I care about Sophie knowing that I'm proud of her exactly as she is. Jennifer sat down without being invited. What about Marcus? What about him? You're falling in love with a dying man. I can see it. Sophie can probably see it. What happens when he dies, then I'll grieve. And Sophie will grieve. And we'll survive because he taught us how to actually be present for each other. That's worth the pain that's coming. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out her tablet and began typing. Okay, I'll start drafting your speech. But Catherine, what? I hope you're right. I hope he lives long enough to see you not need him anymore. I hope the 12% odds work out. But if they don't, promise me you won't regret this. I won't regret loving him. I'd regret not having the courage to do it. Jennifer nodded and left. Catherine sat alone in her office, staring at quarterly projections that suddenly seemed less important than they had 6 months ago. Marcus's health declined gradually at first. He began arriving at the house with shadows under his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. His hands trembled slightly when signing complex phrases. He lost weight that his frame couldn't spare. Sophie noticed. She started bringing him snacks without being asked, presenting crackers and fruit with the solemnity of a nurse administering medicine. She made him rest on the couch, positioning Winston as his companion, and continued her homework nearby so he wouldn't be alone. Then came the afternoon. Marcus didn't show up at his usual time. Catherine called. No answer. She called Bennett Construction and learned he'd called in sick. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and drove to his apartment. Sophie buckled in the back seat with Winston clutched tight. They found his door unlocked. Marcus was on his bathroom floor, conscious, but weak, phone in hand, from calling the ambulance himself. Why didn't you call me? Catherine knelt beside him, checking his pulse with shaking fingers. Didn't want to scare Sophie. The ambulance arrived minutes later. Catherine rode with him while Jennifer came to get Sophie. At Harborview Medical Center, Dr. Patel delivered news in the clinical language of oncology: rapid progression, aggressive treatment, needed immediately, or transition to comfort care. What does he want? Catherine's voice was steady despite the floor tilting beneath her feet. He says he wants to finish teaching you. The doctor's expression was kind, but pragmatic. We can start a more aggressive protocol. It'll buy time, but the side effects are significant. Fatigue, nausea, pain, or we focus on quality of life for whatever time remains. Start the treatment, whatever it takes. Marcus's voice was rough but clear from the hospital bed. Whatever time I have, I want to be present for it. Not just existing, living. The treatment began within hours. Catherine stayed through the night, holding his hand while poison dripped into his veins to fight the poison already there. Sophie had drawn a picture before Jennifer took her home, Marcus, Catherine, and Sophie with Winston, all holding hands under a sun that took up half the page. Catherine taped it to the wall where Marcus could see it from his bed. She's worried about you. Tell her I'm fighting. Tell her I'm not giving up. I will. But Marcus, what I love you. I should have said it before. I love you and I'm terrified and I don't know how to do this. You don't have to know how. You just have to show up. That's all any of us can do. He pulled her down beside him on the narrow hospital bed. They lay together in the sterile room with machines beeping their mechanical reassurance, and Catherine allowed herself to imagine a future that statistics said would never come. Richard Ashford appeared at Catherine's office 3 days later. She was preparing to leave for the hospital when her assistant announced his unscheduled arrival. He stood in her doorway in a suit that cost more than most cars, his expression carrying the weight of something unsaid. I need to talk to you about the complaint. Catherine's hand stilled on her briefcase. Get out, please. Just 5 minutes. There was something in his voice that stopped her from calling security. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. He sat heavily, suddenly looking all of his 62 years. It was me. I filed the anonymous complaint against Marcus Chen. Ice crystallized in Catherine's veins. Why? Because I saw my son. Thomas. I saw him and Sophie, and I saw you making the same mistakes I made, and I couldn't watch another child disappear into silence while their parents stood by and did nothing. So you tried to destroy the one person actually helping her. I tried to protect her from getting attached to someone who would leave. Like all the therapists left Thomas when insurance stopped paying. Like I left him alone in that boarding school because professionals convinced me it was best. Richard's voice cracked. Catherine had never heard him sound anything but certain. Thomas was 9 when the anxiety started. Couldn't speak in class. Panic attacks at restaurants. I did everything right. Best schools, top therapists. Lawrence Academy cost $60,000 a year. They promised structure, support, transformation. What happened? He learned to fake it, learned to smile on demand, say the right things, but inside he was disappearing. By college, he was so good at pretending I didn't see it until his roommate called at 3 in the morning. Your son jumped from the 6th floor. He left a note. Catherine's anger wavered, confronted with grief that mirrored her own fears. What did it say? 4 words: I tried, I'm tired. And underneath, tell Dad I'm sorry I couldn't be fixed. Richard's shoulders shook. Catherine had spent 3 years on the board with this man and never seen him as anything but ruthlessly composed. When I see Sophie choosing silence, I see Thomas. When I see you letting her stay silent instead of forcing her into programs and interventions, I wonder if I'd been brave enough to say, fuck the professionals, and just let my son be different, would he still be alive? Your guilt doesn't give you the right to sabotage my daughter's healing. I know. I'm resigning from the board. But before I go, I want to do something, a foundation. $2 million to start. For kids with selective mutism, anxiety disorders, any child who struggles to speak. The Thomas Ashford Foundation for Silent Voices. He pulled papers from his briefcase, hands trembling slightly. I can't save my son, but maybe I can fund the kind of care that actually listens instead of fixes. Care like what Marcus gave Sophie. Care like what you're learning to give her yourself. Catherine took the papers. The legal language outlined programs, funding structures, scholarship criteria. It was thorough, genuine, the act of a man trying to build meaning from tragedy. He would have been proud of this. Your son. Richard nodded and unable to speak. Catherine stood and did something she'd never imagined. She walked around her desk and embraced the man who had tried to destroy Marcus. He wept against her shoulder like a child finally allowed to grieve. When he left, Catherine sat alone in her office with papers that would change thousands of lives. She thought about Thomas alone in his dorm room, believing he was too broken to deserve love. She thought about Sophie learning that her difference wasn't damage. She thought about Marcus fighting cancer to give them time to learn what he already knew. That love isn't about fixing people. Love is about learning their language and speaking it back to them even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Marcus was discharged after 2 weeks. The aggressive treatment had taken its toll, but the initial scans showed promise. The tumor had shrunk by 15%. Small mercy, but mercy nonetheless. Catherine converted her guest room into a recovery space. Against Marcus's protest, she insisted he stay in the house where she and Sophie could help with the daily realities of healing. He was too weak to argue effectively. Sophie took her role as co-caregiver seriously. She made Marcus elaborate get-well cards with glitter and stickers that shed across the entire house. She read to him not aloud but signing the words from picture books while Winston sat propped beside them. She brought him water without being asked and reported his condition to Catherine with the gravity of a physician making rounds. One evening, Catherine tucked Sophie into bed and returned to find Marcus standing at her bedroom door. He looked fragile in a way that made her chest ache. "I need to tell you something." "Okay, I'm moving back to my apartment next week. Dr. Patel cleared me. But you're still recovering. I need to not be the patient in your house. I need to not be the project you're managing. You're not a project, I'm becoming one. You're adjusting your schedule around my medication times. You're monitoring my food intake. You're turning into my nurse instead of what? Instead of the woman I'm falling in love with. And Sophie needs to see you as her mother, not as someone whose identity is wrapped up in caring for sick people." "Marcus, you're not." "I'm dying, Catherine. Maybe slower than we thought, but it's still happening. And when I go, you and Sophie need to be able to stand on your own, as a family, without needing me in the middle. So you're leaving, I'm creating appropriate distance. I'll still come for lessons, still spend time with Sophie. But I can't live here. You need to learn how to be her mother without me as a safety net." Catherine wanted to argue. Instead, she recognized the truth in his words, even as they carved hollow spaces in her chest. "One condition: what you eat dinner with us. Every night you are strong enough. You don't get to just disappear from our lives. Deal." He kissed her, then soft and careful, like someone memorizing a moment against future absence. When he pulled back, his eyes held everything he couldn't promise. The gala loomed 2 weeks away. Catherine drafted her speech with Jennifer's help, discarding versions that felt too careful or too raw. She wanted honest without being maudlin, authentic without turning Sophie into a spectacle. She practiced signing in front of her bathroom mirror, refining movements until they felt natural rather than performed. Sophie watched sometimes from the doorway, offering corrections with the patience Marcus had taught her. One evening, Catherine asked her daughter the question that had been building. "How do you feel about going to the gala? About me signing with you in front of all those people?" Sophie's hands moved thoughtfully. "Will Marcus be there if he's feeling strong enough? Yes. Then I want to go. I want people to see that my voice works even when it's quiet." Catherine pulled her daughter close, marveling at wisdom that seemed too old for 6 years. The night before the gala, Catherine couldn't sleep. She wandered to her home office and found Marcus in the kitchen making tea despite the late hour. He'd driven over on a whim, unable to stay away. Nervous about tomorrow, terrified. What if I forget the signs? What if Sophie freezes? What if the board uses this as ammunition to force me out? Then you'll deal with it. You've been dealing with boards and shareholders for 15 years. This is just one more negotiation, except this time you're negotiating for what actually matters. What if I fail her? You won't. You know why? Because failure isn't Sophie not speaking. Failure is you not showing up. And you've been showing up every day since you learned what she actually needed. How do you always know what to say? Practice. Years of saying the wrong things to my wife after Lily died. Years of therapy learning that sometimes the most helpful thing is just bearing witness without trying to fix anything. I'm going to miss you. When you're gone, I'm going to miss these conversations. Then we'd better make sure every conversation counts while I'm here. They sat together in her kitchen as dawn approached, two people learning how to love without guarantees, finding grace in the uncertainty. The morning of the gala arrived with Seattle's typical November drizzle. Catherine woke before her alarm, anxiety coiled tight in her stomach like a spring wound past tolerance. She found Sophie already awake in the kitchen, Winston positioned on the table like a sentinel. "Are you scared, Mama?" Sophie's hands formed the question with precision. Catherine marveled at how far they'd come from the child who wouldn't look up from the floor. Terrified. What if I mess up the signs in front of everyone? Then I'll fix them, like I always do. The simple confidence in her daughter's response steadied something in Catherine's chest. She pulled Sophie into an embrace that the child returned without hesitation. They spent the morning preparing with ritualistic care. Sophie's purple velvet dress hung in her closet, selected after 3 shopping trips, where Catherine learned to let her daughter make choices without managing every detail. Winston required a bow tie, which they fashioned from ribbon, while Marcus watched from the doorway. He'd arrived early despite Catherine's insistence that he rest. The treatment had carved hollows beneath his cheekbones, made his hands look too large for his wrists, but his eyes held steady determination. "You look different." Sophie signed the observation to Marcus without judgment. He knelt to her level movements, careful. "The medicine makes me tired, but I'm getting stronger, strong enough to watch you and your mom be brave tonight." "You're brave too, fighting the sick." "I'm trying. Some days that's all we can do, just try." Sophie hugged him with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood loss lived in proximity to love. Marcus held her carefully as if she might break, though Catherine suspected it was Marcus who felt fragile. The drive to the Metropolitan Hotel took 40 minutes through traffic that gave Catherine too much time to rehearse worst-case scenarios. Jennifer drove while Catherine sat in back with Sophie, practicing signs that her daughter had already perfected. "Stop worrying. You know the words." Sophie's hands moved with exasperated affection that reminded Catherine painfully of who her daughter might have been without 8 months of silence. "I just want to get it right. For you, you already got it right. You learned my language. Everything else is just talking." The wisdom of children, Catherine thought, could devastate as thoroughly as it healed. The Metropolitan's grand ballroom glittered with the excessive wealth of Seattle's tech elite. 500 guests in designer labels and practiced charm, their conversations creating white noise that made Catherine's skin itch. Sophie's hand tightened in hers as they entered. Heads turned. Whispers rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Catherine Reynolds had brought her daughter. Catherine Reynolds was carrying a stuffed elephant in a bow tie. Catherine Reynolds looked nervous, which was more shocking than anything else, because Catherine Reynolds never looked nervous. Sarah Chen intercepted them near the champagne tower. Her smile was tight with concern. "This is highly irregular. We discussed keeping Sophie out of the public eye until plans changed." Catherine's voice carried steel that made Sarah step back. "The media is here. Every tech blog in the city. If this goes badly, then it goes badly. But I'm done hiding my daughter because the board thinks differently. Able children hurt our brand." Marcus materialized beside them, moving with careful deliberation. He wore the same suit from Sophie's first interview, and Catherine realized with a pang that it probably was his only suit. He looked gaunt but present, his attention focused entirely on Sophie. "Ready." He signed the question to the child, who nodded solemnly. Winston was clutched against her chest like armor. They made their way to reserved seats near the front. Catherine felt eyes tracking them, heard the subtle increase in conversation volume as speculation spread. She'd spent 15 years commanding rooms through confidence and preparation. Tonight felt like standing naked under interrogation lights. The dinner passed in a blur of courses Catherine couldn't taste. Sophie ate with surprising appetite, occasionally signing observations to Marcus about the excessive flower arrangements, or the woman 3 tables over whose laugh could shatter glass. When Catherine's name was called for her speech, the room settled into expectant quiet. She stood, then reached down for Sophie's hand. Together they walked to the stage. The podium stood like an execution block under spotlights that made Catherine's eyes water. She'd given hundreds of speeches from stages like this. None had mattered like this moment. "Good evening," her voice carried through the sound system with practiced authority. "For those who don't know me, I'm Catherine Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Tech. For those who do know me, you're probably wondering what I'm doing with a 6-year-old and a stuffed elephant on stage." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Catherine felt Sophie's hand tremble slightly in hers. "This is my daughter, Sophie, and this is Winston. They're here tonight because I've spent the last 4 months learning something that 15 years of building this company never taught me." She paused, letting the silence build. "Sophie has selective mutism. For those unfamiliar, it's an anxiety disorder where a person cannot speak in certain social situations, not by choice, but because their nervous system shuts down the ability to produce words. 10 months ago, she stopped speaking entirely. Catherine's voice caught slightly. She'd rehearsed this part a dozen times, but emotions still ambushed her. I did what any CEO would do. I threw money at the problem. $180,000 in specialists, speech therapists with prestigious degrees, behavioral interventions, intensive therapy protocols, and nothing worked because I was trying to fix her. I was treating my daughter like a malfunctioning product that needed debugging. The room was utterly silent now. Catherine could see board members shifting uncomfortably. Then I hired a man named Marcus Chen. She gestured toward Marcus in the audience. Cameras swiveled to capture him, looking acutely uncomfortable with the attention. Marcus is a carpenter. He has a high school diploma and a trade certification. On paper, he was the least qualified candidate I interviewed. But Marcus had something none of the expensive professionals had. He knew what it was like to love someone who communicates differently. Marcus taught me something. He taught me that my daughter doesn't need to be fixed. She needs to be heard. And the way you hear someone isn't always with your ears. Catherine turned to Sophie, raising her hands. Sophie, can you teach them? Her daughter nodded suddenly, shy under the lights and hundreds of watching eyes. But she stepped forward. Winston still clutched tight. Together, Catherine and Sophie signed while Catherine spoke the translation. This means I love you. Their hands formed the shapes in unison. A few people in the audience shifted forward, trying to see better. This means family. Sophie added Winston to the sign, making the audience chuckle. This means home. Sophie pointed to her heart with both hands. Catherine felt tears threatening, but pushed forward. And this Sophie signed in a longer phrase, movements fluid and certain. Means I'm proud of who I am. The room held its breath. Then one person began signing back from the audience. Richard Ashford, his movements clumsy but earnest. He formed shapes that Catherine now recognized. I'm sorry. Sophie looked to her mother, confused by this interaction with a man she barely knew. Catherine signed privately to her daughter. He said he's sorry for being scared. Sophie considered this. Then she signed back to Richard with the simple forgiveness of childhood. It's okay. Catherine faced the audience again, her voice stronger. I'm stepping down as CEO of Reynolds Tech effective next quarter. Thomas Park will assume the role. Gasps erupted across the room. Phones emerged from pockets and clutches, fingers already flying across screens. I'm not leaving because I failed. I'm leaving because I succeeded at something more important than building a billion-dollar company. I succeeded at learning my daughter's language. She knelt to Sophie's level on the stage cameras, capturing every moment. I love you. I see you. I hear you. Catherine signed the words without speaking them, a private conversation made public, because some truth mattered more than privacy. Sophie signed back, I love you, Mama. Then Sophie did something no one expected. She laughed. Not silent laughter this time, but sound, pure, joyful noise that carried through the speakers and filled the vast space with something the room had too little of: genuine human connection. The ballroom erupted. Not polite applause, but standing ovation that felt more like release than approval. People were crying, hard-edged investors and jaded journalists wiping their eyes without shame. Marcus stood in the audience, tears streaming down his face unchecked. Catherine found his eyes across the distance and saw everything they'd never been able to promise each other, reflected back: love despite impossible odds, presence despite limited time, choosing courage over certainty. The moment crystallized into the kind of memory that would define everything that came after. The aftermath came in waves. By midnight, video of Catherine signing with Sophie had 12 million views across social media platforms. By morning, it was 20 million and climbing. Bloomberg: Catherine Reynolds steps down as Reynolds Tech CEO, cites family priorities. TechCrunch: when success means knowing when to step back, Catherine Reynolds' choice. Seattle Times: CEO's sign language speech goes viral, sparks conversation about workplace parents. The comment sections were predictable chaos. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of shirking fiduciary duty. Most simply shared their own stories of children who communicated differently, of struggles with speech disorders and developmental delays, and the isolation that came from feeling like the only family facing such challenges. Catherine read none of it. She spent the day after the gala in her living room with Sophie and Marcus, eating takeout and watching terrible movies existing in the eye of a media hurricane with the people who made the storm worthwhile. The transition took 3 months to finalize. Thomas Park proved as capable as Catherine had predicted, which made stepping back easier even as it destabilized her sense of identity. She was no longer CEO Catherine Reynolds. She was just Catherine, mother of Sophie, partner of Marcus, woman, learning to exist without a title to define her worth. The adjustment was harder than she'd anticipated. The first Monday morning after the transition became official, Catherine woke at 6 out of habit. She showered, dressed in a suit, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with nowhere to go. Sophie was still asleep. Marcus wouldn't arrive until 8. The house felt too quiet, too empty, too much like a museum of her former life. She opened her laptop and stared at the blank screen. No morning briefing, no calendar packed with back-to-back meetings, no crisis requiring her immediate attention. Her phone buzzed. "Jennifer, how are you doing, lost?" Catherine typed back, then deleted it. Tried again. "Fine. Just adjusting." Liar. "Come to lunch. 12:30. I'll meet you at that place you hate because it has too many plants." Despite everything, Catherine smiled. The restaurant was exactly as she remembered, overrun with ferns and hanging vines, the kind of place that prioritized Instagram aesthetics over actual comfort. Jennifer was already seated, 2 glasses of wine on the table. "It's noon. It's your first day of unemployment. The rules don't apply. I'm not unemployed. I'm transitioning. You're unemployed. Drink." Catherine drank. The wine was better than she expected. "So, how does it feel?" "Terrifying. I've been CEO for 12 years. Before that, I was building the company for 3 years. I don't know who I am without it. You're Sophie's mom, Marcus's partner, Catherine Chen, if you take his name. Those are pretty good starting points. I thought I'd feel relieved. Instead, I just feel hollow." Jennifer leaned forward. "You spent 15 years defining yourself by your work. It's going to take more than 3 months to figure out who you are without it. Give yourself time. What if I never figure it out? Then you'll stumble around in the dark with the rest of us. Welcome to being human, Catherine. It's uncomfortable, but the company's good." They sat in the plant-infested restaurant for 3 hours, and when Catherine finally drove home, she felt marginally less lost. Sophie started at Seattle School for the Deaf in January, a progressive institution where sign language was taught alongside spoken English, and difference was celebrated rather than corrected. The first day, Catherine walked her daughter to the classroom door, heart pounding with the irrational fear that Sophie would retreat into silence again. Instead, Sophie signed enthusiastically to her new teacher, then waved goodbye to Catherine with confidence that bordered on dismissal. "You can go now, Mama." Sophie's hands formed the words with a gentle impatience that made Catherine laugh through unexpected tears. She stood in the hallway watching through the classroom window as Sophie introduced Winston to a little girl with cochlear implants. The 2 children began signing to each other with the rapid fluency of native speakers, and Catherine realized her daughter had found something she'd never had at her old school peers who spoke her language. Marcus appeared beside her, having driven over from a construction site to witness Sophie's first day. "She's going to be fine. I know. You're realizing she doesn't need you the way she used to." Catherine nodded, throat tight. "That's not a bad thing. That's the whole point. You raised her to be strong enough to not need you hovering. When did you get so wise? Terminal illness gives you perspective. Highly recommend. 0 stars." The delivery was so dry that Catherine laughed despite herself. Marcus took her hand. "Come on, let me buy you the worst coffee Seattle has to offer, and you can tell me all about your existential crisis." They sat in a terrible diner with coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, and Catherine talked about feeling untethered, about missing the adrenaline of crisis management, about the strange guilt of having time to just exist. Marcus listened without trying to fix anything, which was exactly what she needed. Catherine volunteered 3 days a week at the Thomas Ashford Foundation, helping establish programs in 12 states for children with selective mutism and anxiety disorders. Richard had thrown himself into the work with converts' zeal channeling decades of guilt into something constructive. One afternoon in February, Catherine found him in the foundation office staring at a photograph of a young man with his father's eyes and a smile that looked painted on. Thomas Richard nodded. He was 19 in this picture. Sophomore year at Yale, 2 weeks before he jumped. I keep trying to see the signs I missed, but all I see is a kid who learned to perform happiness so well that his own father couldn't see through it. Catherine sat down beside him. You can't change what happened, but you're changing what happens next for other families. That matters. Does it? Will any of this bring him back? No. But it might save someone else's Thomas. Isn't that worth doing? Richard was quiet for a long moment. There's a family in Portland. Their daughter has selective mutism, 8 years old. The parents are considering residential placement because nothing else has worked. I want to send them to a specialist we've been working with, someone who actually understands trauma-based treatment. Will you call them parent to parent? Catherine called that evening. The mother answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the exhausted desperation Catherine remembered from her own darkest days. They talked for 2 hours. Catherine shared Sophie's story, described Marcus, explained sign language not as a cure but as a bridge. By the end of the call, the mother was crying with something that sounded like hope. Thank you. I just needed to hear from someone who understood. After she hung up, Catherine sat in her home office feeling something she hadn't felt since stepping down as CEO useful. Marcus's condition remained stubbornly stable through February and into March. The experimental treatment kept the cancer from advancing, but couldn't eliminate it entirely. He existed in medical purgatory, not dying fast enough to abandon hope, not healing enough to plan futures beyond next week. Catherine learned to celebrate small victories. Days when Marcus had enough energy to work a half shift at Bennett Construction. Evenings when he stayed for dinner without exhaustion, overwhelming him by dessert. Mornings when he woke without the nausea that had become his unwelcome companion. Sophie adapted to their new reality with the resilience of children who had already survived one world ending. She drew elaborate plans for the garden she wanted to plant with Marcus in spring. She made lists of places they'd visit when he felt better. She constructed futures that statistics suggested would never arrive, and Catherine couldn't bring herself to temper the child's hope with probability. One evening in late March, Marcus was helping Sophie with homework, while Catherine prepared dinner. The kitchen smelled of garlic and tomatoes, and the normalcy they'd managed to build from impossible circumstances. Sophie was explaining a math problem through sign language when Marcus began coughing. Nothing alarming at first, just a dry cough that had become background noise in their lives. But it didn't stop. Marcus doubled over, hand clutching the table edge, coughing with increasing violence. His face reddened, then began taking on an alarming grayish cast as he struggled to draw breath between convulsions. Marcus, breathe. Catherine rushed over, hand on his back, useless in the face of his body's rebellion. Sophie stood frozen, her math homework, forgotten eyes wide with the particular terror of watching someone you love unable to perform the basic function of breathing. The coughing continued, harsh and wet and wrong. Marcus gasped between bouts, trying to speak, trying to signal that he was okay even as his body proved otherwise. And then Sophie's mouth opened. Stop! The word ripped from her throat, raw and unpracticed, her first spoken sound in 11 months, hitting the air like a thunderclap. The room fractured into before and after. Marcus's coughing subsided, perhaps from shock at hearing Sophie's voice, or perhaps from the natural end of the fit. He stared at the child, eyes wide. Catherine stood paralyzed between them, her mind unable to process what she just heard. Sophie's hands flew to her mouth, her own eyes huge with surprise at the sound she'd produced. Please don't die. Her voice was small, rusty from disuse, but unmistakably clear. Words. Real words vibrating with fear and love, and the desperate need to stop something that couldn't be stopped through force of will. Marcus dropped to his knees despite his weakness, bringing himself to Sophie's level. I heard you. His voice cracked with emotion that transcended the physical pain of his coughing fit. I talked. Sophie's whisper carried wonder and fear in equal measure. You did, and it was perfect. Sophie moved into Marcus's arms, burying her face against his shoulder. I'm scared, her voice muffled against his shirt. Me too. But we're scared together, okay? That makes it better. Catherine sank to the floor beside them, pulling both into an embrace that felt like holding everything precious and breakable in the world. Sophie had spoken. Her daughter had found her voice at the moment when silence felt most unbearable. The universe, Catherine thought, had a sense of irony that bordered on cruelty. The days following Sophie's breakthrough moved with surreal quality. Her daughter didn't speak constantly, but she used words when they mattered. Good morning, Mama, in the kitchen. I love you, whispered before bed. Marcus, when are you coming back? Asked with a child's inability to understand why adults needed distance to heal. Dr. Tanaka, the trauma-focused therapist Catherine had hired after firing Dr. Morrison, explained the mechanism with clinical precision. The breakthrough makes sense. Sophie's mutism was rooted in anxiety, specifically fear of consequences, when she spoke. Last night she saw someone she loves in danger. Her protective instinct overrode her fear. It's actually quite common for selective mutism to break during moments of crisis. So she's cured. Catherine heard the desperation in her own voice. Not cured, healing. She'll still have moments where she can't speak. Anxiety doesn't disappear overnight. But she's proven to herself that she can use her voice. That's huge. Sophie continued using sign language as her primary communication, adding words like punctuation to emphasize meaning. She'd sign a full sentence, then speak the most important word aloud. Home, safe, love. Her vocabulary grew daily, but the signs remained her foundation. Richard's Foundation held its official dedication ceremony in April at Seattle Children's Hospital. The new wing bore Thomas's name in bronze letters that caught afternoon light. Catherine attended with Sophie and Marcus, watching Richard cut ribbon with shaking hands. His speech was brief, choked with emotion he no longer tried to hide. My son Thomas died because I didn't listen. I heard his words, but I didn't listen to his silence. This foundation is my promise to him that other children won't suffer because adults are too rigid to meet them where they are. He unveiled a plaque beneath his son's name. Thomas Ashford Wing for Communication Disorders. Where silence is heard and every voice matters. Sophie tugged Catherine's sleeve, then signed a question. Can I talk to him? Catherine nodded. Sophie approached Richard with Winston held carefully, then spoke in her quiet voice that still startled Catherine each time. I'm sorry about your son. Richard knelt, tears already streaming. Thank you, sweetheart. I'm sorry I was mean to Marcus. Marcus taught me that sad people sometimes hurt other people, but they don't mean to. The wisdom of 6-year-olds delivered with such casual profundity made Richard weep harder. He pulled Sophie into a careful hug that the child permitted, and Catherine saw decades of guilt crack open to let something like redemption seep through. Marcus's 6-month scan in May brought news that Dr. Patel delivered with cautious optimism. The tumor is 65% smaller than initial presentation. Your markers are stable. This is beyond what we hoped for with the experimental protocol. So I'm in remission. Marcus's voice held hope he'd been afraid to acknowledge. Not remission, but significant response. You could have years instead of months. We need to continue treatment. Monitor closely, but Marcus, you beat some very long odds. How many years, I can't promise numbers. But I'm cautiously optimistic about seeing you at next year's checkup, and the year after that. Catherine cried in the parking lot while Marcus held her, his own face wet with tears that weren't entirely joy. Survival brought its own complications, plans to make futures, to consider the weight of hope after accepting its absence. That evening, Marcus made dinner at his apartment and invited Catherine and Sophie. The space still felt temporary despite the months he'd lived there, as if he'd been afraid to commit to permanence. After Sophie fell asleep on his couch, exhausted from celebrating news she didn't fully understand, Marcus pulled a small box from his desk drawer. I bought this 2 months ago. Probably premature given everything, but I couldn't not have it. He opened the box to reveal a simple ring, white gold band, with small diamonds forming a wave pattern. Nothing ostentatious, but beautiful in its clean design. I can't promise you 50 years, maybe not even 20, but I can promise you every day I have, I'll wake up and choose you. Choose Sophie. Choose this family we've built from broken pieces. His hands shook slightly as he held the box. Catherine Reynolds, will you marry me despite all the reasons this is a terrible idea? Catherine laughed through tears, the sound mixing relief and joy and the bittersweet knowledge that every yes carried its no. Yes. 1,000 times yes. They married in June in Catherine's backyard. 40 guests including Jennifer Thomas Park, Richard Ashford, Dr. Tanaka workers from Bennett Construction, and Sophie's new friends from school. Nothing elaborate, just people who mattered bearing witness to promises made without guarantee of their duration. Sophie served as flower girl, walking the aisle with Winston in one hand and rose petals in the other. She spoke her part clearly when asked. I do, because my mom deserves to be happy, and Marcus makes her happy. The vows were brief. Marcus promised to listen with his heart, to love Sophie as his daughter to choose their family every day he had breath. Catherine promised to see him as he was rather than who she wanted him to be, to honor the time they had instead of mourning the time they wouldn't. They kissed while 40 people cheered and cried, and for one perfect afternoon, the future felt navigable. Marcus moved back into Catherine's house permanently, the pretense of distance abandoned, in favor of making the most of mornings waking up together. He taught woodworking classes at Sophie's school, patient hands, guiding children with and without hearing through the satisfaction of creating something solid. On a Saturday in August, Catherine found Marcus and Sophie in the garage building, a bookshelf for Sophie's room. Sawdust covered everything, including Winston, who sat on the workbench wearing protective goggles that Sophie had insisted he needed. "Looks dangerous." Catherine leaned against the doorframe watching them work. "Very dangerous." Winston almost lost a paw to the sander. Marcus's delivery was deadpan. Sophie giggled, a sound Catherine still marveled at hearing. "We're making something that lasts." Sophie signed the words, then spoke them aloud for emphasis. "That's the best kind of thing to make." Catherine crossed the garage and joined them at the workbench. Marcus showed her how to measure twice, cut once. Sophie demonstrated the proper way to sand with the grain. They worked together until the light began to fail, building something that would hold Sophie's books long after the hands that crafted it were gone. Sophie's 8th birthday came in September, with a party full of signing and speaking children creating joyful chaos. She had started a blog, Winston's World, telling stories through her stuffed elephant's perspective, mixing English prose with sign language videos. Parents of children with selective mutism found it shared. It wrote messages thanking Sophie for making their kids feel less alone. One message from a mother in Ohio made Catherine cry. "My son hasn't spoken in 2 years. Today he watched your videos and signed to me for the first time. He said he wants to be like Winston, brave even when he's scared. Thank you for giving my child hope." Sophie read the message and looked up at Catherine with eyes too old for 8. "Can we help them, Mama? All the kids like me. We're already helping them. Every video you make, every story you tell, you're showing them they're not alone. But we could do more. We could make a place where kids can come and learn signs and not be scared." Marcus, listening from the kitchen, caught Catherine's eye. His expression said what they were both thinking: out of the mouths of children come ideas that change worlds. 2 months later, Catherine pitched the idea to Richard at the foundation office, a summer camp for children with selective mutism and communication disorders, a place where sign language was taught alongside other therapeutic approaches, where difference was celebrated and silence was honored. Richard listened, then pulled out his checkbook. "How much do you need to start?" Catherine wrote a book about her experience learning sign language, every penny of profit donated to communication disorder programs. The title was simple: The Language I Didn't Know I Needed. The book launch was in October at Elliott Bay Book Company. 100 people packed the small space, most of them parents of children who communicated differently. Sophie stood beside Catherine at the podium, Winston in her arms, and helped demonstrate signs while Catherine read excerpts. One section near the end resonated particularly strongly. "I spent 15 years building an empire by solving problems. I approach my daughter's silence the same way as a problem requiring a solution. But silence isn't a problem. It's a language I didn't know I needed to learn. Marcus taught me that love isn't about fixing people. It's about learning how they speak and speaking back to them imperfectly, perhaps, but with intention that matters more than precision." The audience applauded. Phones came out. One woman raised her hand during Q&A. "My daughter stopped talking after my divorce. I've spent 2 years trying everything to get her to speak again. Should I stop trying?" Catherine chose her words carefully. "Don't stop trying, but maybe shift what you're trying to do. Instead of trying to make her speak, try to understand what she's saying through her silence. Learn her language, whatever that looks like. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is meet our children where they are instead of where we want them to be." The book hit the New York Times bestseller list 3 weeks later. Catherine received calls from morning shows, podcasts, parenting magazines. She accepted some, declined most. The work at the foundation felt more important than publicity. Reynolds Tech thrived under Thomas Park's leadership. The stock price had recovered completely and was now 10% higher than when Catherine stepped down. She felt relieved rather than resentful. The company didn't need her specifically. It just needed good leadership, and Thomas provided that without the martyr complex Catherine had brought to the role. On a December afternoon, Catherine sat in the foundation office reviewing applications for the summer camp program. They'd received 300 applications for 50 spots. Reading through the stories, children who hadn't spoken in years, parents desperate for anything that might help Catherine felt the same sense of purpose she'd once gotten from closing a major deal. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus, can you come home? Sophie wants to show you something." Catherine drove home through Seattle drizzle, wondering what project had Sophie so excited. She found them in the living room, Marcus filming on his phone, while Sophie practiced what appeared to be a TED Talk. "Welcome to Winston's world. Today we're talking about being different." Sophie spoke clearly now, though she still signed, while talking, a habit Catherine hoped she'd never lose. "Lots of kids are scared to be different. I was scared too, but my mom learned my language and that made me brave. So if you're different, don't be scared. Find people who want to learn your language. And if you can't find them, be patient. They might just need time to figure out what you already know. Different isn't broken. Different is just different." Winston, positioned beside Sophie, seemed to nod in agreement. Marcus stopped recording. Sophie looked at Catherine with nervous hope. "It's for the camp, to show kids they're not alone." "Is it okay? It's perfect." Catherine pulled her daughter into a hug. That evening, the three of them sat on the back porch watching twilight paint the sky. Sophie was drawing plans for the garden they'd plant next spring. She'd decided Winston needed a vegetable patch, specifically for elephant-sized carrots. Marcus reviewed the plans with the seriousness of an architect examining blueprints. Winston sat in his place of honor on the porch railing, bow tie slightly askew from years of love, presiding over the proceedings with the quiet dignity of a witness to transformation. When Sophie finished her drawing, she signed a question to Marcus. "Will you always be my dad?" Always means different things to different people. "But yes, Sophie, for as long as I'm here, I'm your dad. And even after that, I'll still be your dad in every way that matters." "How can you be my dad if you're gone, because love doesn't end when someone dies? It just changes form. Your love for me will keep me alive in your memories, in the things I taught you, in the way you treat other people who need kindness." Sophie considered this with her characteristic gravity, then nodded acceptance. "Okay, then you'll be my dad forever, even when you're dead." The blunt delivery made Marcus laugh, the sound rich and full, despite his diminished frame. "Yeah, kiddo, even when I'm dead." Catherine watched them, her husband and her daughter, and understood that Marcus had given them the greatest gift possible, not the promise of forever, but the presence to make right now enough. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Catherine and Marcus lay together in the darkness of their bedroom. His hand found hers under the covers, fingers intertwining in shapes that needed no translation. "Thank you," Catherine whispered the words into the space between them. "For what? For teaching me that love doesn't require guarantees. For showing me how to hear my daughter. For staying when you could have protected yourself by leaving. You did the same for me. You loved me when I was dying, when I told you not to, when every rational instinct said to protect yourself. That's courage I didn't know existed until I met you." They held each other in the quiet house, two people who had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was love without promises, show up without guarantees, and choose presence over certainty. The cancer would come back eventually. The statistics were clear about that. But tonight, Marcus was alive. Sophie was sleeping safely down the hall. And Catherine had learned a language that transcended words. She had spent 15 years measuring success in quarterly increments, building an empire worth billions. But this family, constructed from broken pieces and impossible circumstances, and the courage to love, despite knowing how it would end, this was the only thing she'd ever built that truly mattered. Home wasn't where you talked. Home was where you were heard, where your silence was honored as much as your words, where love meant learning someone else's language and speaking it back to them. Marcus's breathing evened into sleep beside her. Catherine stayed awake a while longer, listening to him breathe, to Sophie's quiet movements down the hall, to the house settling around them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The cancer would progress or stabilize. Sophie would have good days and hard days. The foundation would grow or struggle, and life would continue in its beautiful, uncertain way. But tonight was enough. This moment was enough, and perhaps that was the final lesson Marcus had taught her, that enough was actually everything.